All right, so we're live. I'm American Grayson with Pure Politics, and we have Tho Bishop from the Mises Institute joining us today. Thank you for coming on.
Glad to join you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so to start out, I didn't know anything about the Mises Institute until we met. So I'd like to start out by asking, what do you do there, and what is the Mises Institute?
I'm an assistant editor for the Institute. We're I think, a very interesting organization. Our focus is primarily economic education, first and foremost, because I think one of the biggest problems we have in society today is that the economics, as a discipline, as a science, has been totally hijacked. The great untold stories of the 20th century, the Keynesian revolution, kind of really took what was supposed to be a understanding of social science of how do we as unique individuals in a world of scarcity utilize resources in a way to satisfy our wants and needs. That really kind of leads to the building of prosperity, right? So poverty is the original state of nature. How do we get to live in a world of that we get to enjoy today? The problem is that economics kind of became hijacked for government planners, bureaucrats, things like that. Keynes kind of convinced government officials that, hey, look, you can ignore these rules of economics that we had been understanding as a discipline, and we can use it to justify government spending, and this is the way we get out of depressions, things like that. And so we're kind of in this big uphill battle trying to get people to think about economics as a kind of logically deductive science. We're named after Ludwig von Mises, who was a complete badass. He was a Austrian scholar from the university. He was a student at the University of Vienna, was a professor there. The Austrian school itself started with Karl Menger, who was kind of interesting because he was the equivalent of like a Wall Street Journal reporter, and they kind of recognized that a lot of the way that some price theory, things like that, the way that a lot of the academics at the time were looking at economics didn't really relate to real prices and the way they worked out in the markets. And so he developed this entire branch of science, his own contributions there to marginal revolution, kind of understanding, that it's marginal value of items that we really are looking at, things like that. And so he helped inspire Mises. Mises served in World War I. He was an artillery captain for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so this was also kind of interesting because he saw, the collapse of a great empire during his time as a consequence, not only the defeat in World War I, but also hyperinflationary environments that came in the German-speaking world after that. Because he was a Jewish free market economist, when the Nazis came in, he had to flee. They actually tried to hunt him down in Switzerland. It's kind of an interesting story. He then had to move over to the U.S. And by that time, and even in America, the Keynesian revolution was so strong that in spite of the incredible background, tremendous amount of scholastic productivity, he had a difficult time getting academia. And so kind of really since the 30s and 40s, that the intellectual landscape had turned sort of way where if it wasn't for donors and patrons that kind of paid for him to be able to have a teaching position at the University of New York, he would have been on the outs. And so the Institute has been trying to preserve the ideas of Ludwig von Mises, promote the ideas of Ludwig von Mises. One of our founders, Murray Rothbard, who was a tremendous libertarian scholar. And then also Ron Paul was one of our founding members. And so, when Ron Paul was out there criticizing the Fed and talking about sound money and that sort of aspect of free market economics, that kind of ties into some of the stuff that we did at the Institute. And our primary goal is economic education for both students, lay people, professionals, and also grooming scholars to help kind of continue the tradition going forward, because particularly in an environment like we have right now with complex financial markets and the way banking's changed, over time, there's a lot of application, I think, of the uniquely sort of Austrian ideas into booms and busts and credit expansion and inflation and things like that in the modern world. So we kind of do a lot of different things in that regard.
So to sum up a lot of what you said, because you unpacked a whole lot of information there.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to kind of just set a scenario out something.
That von Mises kind of made a science out of economy, right? To oversimplify it, he turned to being an economist into a science in a way, right?
Well, it really, yeah. I mean, when he created his kind of unique contribution was kind of the method of social science, which he called praxeology. And it was kind of really understanding that in order for us to understand how humans function as society, we have to understand that we are purposeful beings, that we have our own individual motivations, and that therefore any understanding of social science must start with that kind of methodological individualism. And what's incredible is that when you recognize how much of the way that there's so many built-in assumptions within economics or a lot of social sciences in general that ignores that individual component, that's where we get a lot of disconnect from what the experts at the Fed, for example, will predict markets do and what markets actually do. And this is actually a major disagreement because Milton Friedman's another libertarian economist, very, but he was actually methodologically a lot more Keynes than he was Mises. And so that's where libertarians have to infight. That's this kind of the arena that we're in. There's all sorts of these kind of very minute little differences there, but in practice, there's actually a lot of profound differences. Kind of they all add up to. So there's that's why we have a very unique sort of niche sort of thing, because there's not a lot of people kind of get into economic methodologically and things
it's very intellectual. It's a very intellectual field. And when we talked, you were just throwing a lot of stuff at me, and I'm like, I know the history, but a lot of these terms I have to look up. And it seems like, would you say that Mises and the Mises Institute is kind of the intellectual foundation of libertarianism in a way?
I think so in a lot of ways. Murray Rothbard really was that. He was an incredible American scholar, and he was kind of really the backbone of what was the American libertarian movement in a lot of different ways. And so the Institute really was created as an institution for him to expand his work. Because he was kicked out of Cato, all this sort of fun libertarian backstory there, but really Rothbard, as a student of Mises, the Institute was created an institution that he could help guide new generations of Austrian scholars. And so again, the Ron Paul wing of libertarianism in particular, I think we're definitely kind of a fountainhead of knowledge there. But there's a lot of people out there that never were really comfortable with Ron Paul, that were kind of, they were much discouraging the cultural conservatism of Murray Rothbard and those others. And that's where, again, there's a lot of schisms within that movement. Often for the better. There's a lot of libertarians I don't want to be associated with.
I'm going to bring them up later on, because I know the Mises Institute, they've been, not yours specifically, but in other states, has been getting involved in a lot of the LGBT stuff that seems to be infecting intellectualism and academia. So you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's always kind of been this kind of what libertarianism really is. I think there's actually been a lot of controversy because you have someone like Nicholas like Reason who views libertarianism fundamentally as kind of a celebration of alternative lifestyles, kind of creating experimentation for. It's kind of a view of libertarianism that views individuals as kind of like pleasure maximizing sort of units, right? And so if it feels good, do it. It's sort of kind of libertinism. Whereas at the Austrian school and the Mises approach, Mises was a man of the old right. Murray Rothbard, he outside of some political alliances here and there, he was very much kind of a man of the old right. They understood that libertarianism, the foundation of civilization, was property rights, foundationally, and that this was a tradition that was uniquely Western by nature. And so that has something in this. There's a lot of cultural elements that, I think one of the things that plagues a lot of libertarians is they don't want to engage with the culture debates. But, kind of, there's always been that level of understanding within, I think, a lot of the Austrian movement and a lot of the paleo-libertarian movement, which Ray Rothbard was part of.
Yeah, Rothbard, I have a couple memes from him. One of them is that a successful society is a tradition-bound society. Mm-hmm. So it seems like you're more on his side of that. You can have libertarianism, but there definitely needs to be culture and tradition behind it, or else it's going to go insane. Like a do what thou wilt kind of thing.
Right. And that's the whole thing. And that's one of the things I think is really kind of like one of the important takeaways you get from Austrian economics is the importance of time preference. And like that's, and the idea being there that time preference is, what, how do you allocate resources in terms of, consuming it right now or saving for the future, right? And the problem is that a lot, and so what we understand is that what makes societies prosperous is not consumption, for the sake of consumption, right? That's kind of a Keynesian sort of idea there. What Austrians understand is that it's savings that allow for the build of capital to be able to use for longer term processes. This is kind of the old adage, right? Like, civilizations are built when, people plant trees that their sons, their grandkids are able to enjoy. That's sort of, I think, an important dynamic there. And what's really kind of fascinating, and I know we're going in a lot of different directions here, but like one of the consequences of the Keynesian revolution is that we have created an entire financial system, entire economic system that subsidizes short-term decision making. And again, that's one of, again, and that's where I think that there's a lot of people on the right that kind of look at economics suspiciously as kind of, bowing down to this altar of markets and corporations and things like that. I think there really are very important cultural lessons to be learned from economics properly understood, that go towards, again, how do we really build a civilization that lasts, and how do we build prosperous communities and families and things like that in ways. And so again, you kind of need, I think both are needed, very much so. The conservative culture, Austrians with economics, and a lot of what Murray Rothbard tried to do during his life, particularly in the 90s, was try to bridge those two gaps for camps that didn't always talk on the same page, if not.
Yeah, kind of related to that in a little bit different subject. Because pure politics are going to get geopolitical now. I was going to ask about China. Their economy is very state-controlled. All their international corporations are promoting Chinese interests. And then when you have America, you could say it's more of a libertarian type of economy. It's more laissez-faire. Our corporations do not promote American interests abroad, and many times they are being subverted by foreigners to not promote American interests domestically. So how would you approach that?
Well, I think for one, it's important. Like I think that the term that's out there, and it's kind of a vague term, but I think it's a useful one as a concept. It's neoliberalism, right? And it's kind of a convenient boogeyman to the left and things like that, and it's often poorly defined. But I think there is value that neoliberalism, the way I see it, is kind of a government-regulated, globalist by nature sort of marketplace, and so the guy and also backed by a system of central banks, and that side of it I think is very important, because the world that we live in, it's true that there is sort of a disconnect between explicit state goals and corporations on paper, but there's actually I think a tremendous interconnection of the way that central banks have long played a role of benefiting large corporations and a certain aspect of the elite in that perspective, at the expense of the way the market is actually supposed to function. Murray Rothbard, actually, again, a lot of his analysis in kind of American economic history was a kind of explicitly a power-related analysis dynamic. Going and his work on this is great. He'd go in there, name all the names, and get into like the Rockefellers and the Morgans, and the way that the Federal Reserve was created explicitly to be a cartelization device for finances in Wall Street, things like that. And so what that creates is a dynamic where it is not truly a laissez-faire capitalist meritocratic system. Instead, it is a system in America, and by extension, the West and most of the global marketplace, where big corporations benefit from credit expansion and the policies of central banks in ways that protects them and makes them subservient or at least in partnership with the government. Now you have a model in the Chinese model where it is the connection between state and economy is far more explicit, right? Your Communist Party leadership has direct control over most of the large businesses in China. The connection there in politics is even stronger still, because within a local level and local government level and things like that, within China, a lot of the funding for those lower levels of government come explicitly from the state-backed enterprises, things like that. And I think one of the biggest narratives out there when we talk about China that's so vastly overlooked is that if you look back after 2008, and the global financial crisis at that time gets spurred on by a world full of the central bank policies, the credit expansion and expansion of the money supply, and the financialization of the economy in China is far greater than even all the mistakes in America and Europe and other countries have made. And so I think that China, I think, really is perhaps the biggest bubble in human history, because while there is a lot of appearance of market economies, and it's unlike a lot of say the Soviet Union, things like that. There's this massive exporter role within the global economy. It's still, at its core, capital allocation is very strongly politicized. And because of one of the consequences of it, you have a very bureaucratic economy, things like that, and there's consequences there. And so I think that for a lot of people, I think there's a lot of progressives in the West that look at that connection between party, a single party rule, a direct hand of the state with something that kind of looks like a thriving market economy. And I think that in some ways they want to replicate that. And I think that's kind of this access of corporate and state power, particularly with the Biden administration and some of the connections that Kamala Harris's staff has, like big tech and things like that. I think it's all very interesting. I don't think China's created a model where it is somehow stronger than even this kind of neoliberal status quo model of the West, this kind of post-Cold War sort of era. I think both of them have major problems. And what's interesting is actually a country like Russia, kind of, if you look at the spending levels and the way that some of the central bank works, like that's actually perhaps the biggest biggest actual challenge in terms of the way of structuring compared to China and the U.S. because Russia has very, very little debt. Russia has other problems, like
Russia seems really well insulated against global economic forces. Yeah. They seem like the best insulated country.
Yeah. So I think there's problems with both the way that the West operates and what China operates right now, and I think often I think one of the myths that we've been told the West, and both right and left believe it, is that China's government is full of people that are so much smarter than American leadership. And while I have no respect for the mental capacity of most leaders in Washington, I think that China has a lot of the same issues in that regard. They're just able to keep it going longer because of how tightly controlled the financial markets are within the country. I mean, you can even get yuan out of the country, right? So they have a lot more control over the financial side of things. But
what is the end point of all this? Like, it's a big bubble. You said that means it's going to pop eventually. I mean, when is it going to pop? What's the end point? What does it look like? Because China is a very globally influential country. They're stronger than the USSR. They have more symbiosis with America than the USSR ever did.
Yeah, far more closely intertwined economically.
Yes.
One of the issues that you have with China is that when we talk about debt, kind of different types of debt, China has a lot of debt, and a lot of it is yuan nominated debt within internal markets, right? And when it comes to that, China has control over the yuan, right? They have their own bank, they can turn it away. The issue that China has is that they still rely upon a tremendous amount of imports, particularly food and things like that. And those imports have to be paid with foreign currencies, right? And what's interesting is that at the end of 2019, you actually had a lot of major warning signs going on within China. You had a series of largish, not the largest banks, but largish banks in China that were melting down. You had massive increases in price inflation. For example, they had a massive swine flu epidemic. Killed a lot of the Chinese.
About 1/3 of all the pork in the country.
Yeah, and at the same time, they were also not buying American swine because of the trade, the trade war going on there, and so you had massive price inflation going on. You also had a lot of reports about Chinese businesses that were issuing IOUs to workers and things like that. So there's a lot of stress, and then you had COVID happen early 2020, surprise, and then that kind of shook things up in a lot of different ways. But I think that you still have kind of pressure points at times with Chinese dealing with foreign debt, and they've kind of been able to paper out this. There's a great YouTube channel, Jason brought Wall Street and Main Street. That Jason does a lot of great kind of breakdown and analysis of some of the pressure points in China. But I think that that is going to be one area where China is going to start feeling some pressure. But I mean, that's kind of been one of the big questions that's out there, though, because if you have the tools that central banks have are so much different now than they've ever been before. And the problem is that and so they have, for example, like after 2008, right? Everyone was predicting inflation going on in the U.S., right? Because massive amount of money printing, things like that. You have the Federal Reserve charts and the money supply go up like this. Everyone's expecting inflation. The reason why it never happened is because the Fed changed its toolbox, and it started paying big banks not to lend out money. Now that created an issue for American borrowers, neither here nor there. So it gave them greater control over that money going out of the system, right? Because as long as the money stays in the financial system, then it can trade in the real economy, keep inflation relatively low. There's still consequences there. Arab Spring actually had to do like increase food prices and things like that. There's seepage, but so there's, and this is why you see right now this big push for digital currency from central banks, like regardless, ignoring the cryptocurrency side of it, because a digitized currency gives central banks even more power to engage in extreme monetary policy and things like that, because it prevents the ability of residents of countries or political unions, things like that, to withdraw cash from the system. If you keep your money in the banking system, they have a lot more control over the interest rates and things like that. And so that's this kind of interesting. You get this interesting arms race among central bankers on creating new tools to try to cover up the consequences of their actions.
It's a growing central control over the global economy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what's happened is that we now have a landscape of things that they're just kind of these economic abominations, like zombie companies, for example, like zombie companies or corporations where like they have so much, like they keep functioning, but they keep functioning because they have access to credit lines, but they're not able to make enough in revenue to start paying down their debts, and so they keep accumulating debts and debts. And so there's this used to be a Chinese problem, but now it's a European problem. It's an American problem, and so now it created a situation where back in 2008, for example, we had all the big talk was about systemically important big banks that were too big to fail, right, and all these systemically important players. So the problem is that in America now, companies like Uber and Netflix, people don't talk about this, but they are essentially now systemically important economic entities because of how much we have pushed savers and pension fund and municipal governments and major systemic players in the economy. We have pushed them by taking away yields on like government bonds and traditional conservative investments, and we forced them into the stock market. And so that means like you have these corporations that where in the past you'd have a creative destruction, right? If a big company fails, and fine, it lets resources go in the market, find new ways to use it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that doesn't work if a stock is now so important to like the livelihoods of so many American households. Like the political cost of even entertaining the idea of letting the marketplace play out is it's the same issue.
It's ruining companies. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so now we have this entire economy where it's so dictated by political convenience that it size is king, that good business plans and merit and all these things that again historically have been the advantage of a market economy are out the window. So this is again it's a terrifying situation.
I mean, you're laughing at the ridiculousness of it all. It's clown world. Yeah. same thing. I feel that's a big reason probably why you're a libertarian, because it's taken away people's freedom to associate, freedom to make money, freedom to spend it where they want. You're going to be controlled everywhere you go. And now I'm gonna ask you about, from February 23rd to the 24th, the United States printed about 60% of its entire money supply since the beginning. I think like $4 to $5 trillion, and they're planning to print more. I mean, Joe Biden's saying he's going to print a whole bunch more money to fund all this stuff. Everywhere else has led to hyperinflation and collapse.
Well, one advantage that America has right now is that Biden's spending policies. That's been unfortunately, I think, the interesting thing is that Biden's administration, I think, is far to the left of the Obama administration, and it's not because I think Biden probably, if he was being honest, it's probably. For one, obviously Biden's not running things, right?
Obama's pulling strings behind the scenes. Yeah.
Well, but the problem is your average Biden staffer, right, is far to the left of your average Obama staffer, just because that's how far to the left the Democratic Party has gone in the last 6 years, right? And so the spending policies, I think it's going to be much bigger than anything that happened in the Obama years. But the one advantage we have is that as crazy as the Fed has been since 2008 and all that sort of stuff, Europe's much worse than we are. Right? We had low interest rates. Europe had negative interest rates, right? With spending like this, they've got all sorts of countries and they've got a whole additional level of bureaucracy with Brussels and things like that, right? And so that's kind of the one of the saving graces that for all the issues America has, and we've got a ton of them, we're still kind of the cleanest shirt in the laundry. And so I think what we're kind of setting ourselves up for is a lot of global crises, because the problem is that a lot of other countries, including the smaller ones, have followed the lead of what the Fed does, because the Fed's a Fed expert, right? So smaller central banks have acted like the Fed without having the same sort of luxuries. Europe has gone even further than the Fed. And so what you're going to start seeing, I think, is pressure happening at those smaller the smaller central banks, which then ends up building to larger problems. And so it's interesting, in the short term, America could actually benefit from this sort of environment, because when you have, if the Argentinian peso falls, right, the dollar is one of the kind of the go-to safe haven assets that people kind of move into. If Europe has trouble, then the dollar is kind of a safer asset, and so it's going to be a domino effect. But it's a terrifying situation, because there's so much financialization in the world, and when you realize how extreme it all is, and again how disconnected from reality the economists and central bankers, and because there's very much an intellectual hive mind effect going on. If all of your central bankers around the world go to the same Ivy League schools, then it doesn't matter that they come from different countries. They all think the same, right? And so that's one of the things that there's so much groupthink at the highest levels, and it's created a very fragile system in a way that I don't know when it's going to all fall down, but there's every time by their own standing, like the central bankers have said, look, we know how to rewind this. Go back to 2008. We know how to rewind it. We're going to get back to normal. They've never been able to get back to normal, and every time they've tried, like late 2017 or late, Jay Powell tried to slowly roll off some of the Fed stuff, and like markets started freaking out, and they completely backtracked, right? And so that's kind of the situation, is that every time they've tried to follow their own rules, they found it too difficult, and so they break the rules, and that's happens across the world.
Could you give a specific example of that?
So again, the goal, what's happening in the U.S., for example, is that so quantitative easing, the Fed's balance sheet massively expanded. Like, this is one of the things where, so again, the Fed has created all sorts of new devices, kind of from crisis to crisis. Because the Fed started out was supposed to be kind of a banker's bank, kind of a lender of last resort, and then it started manipulating with the interest rate, kind of Greenspan started they're concerned about Chinese deflation, so we're going to kind of lower interest rates for beyond what normally we would allow to, kind of juice it up a little bit to protect against it. 2008, we started buying up assets. We bought toxic mortgages. We bought government debt. We bought debt from other countries, things like that. Massive increase in the balance sheet. We bought a lot of treasuries and things like that. So while some of those treasuries were supposed to be tied, and so what happened is that when government treasuries were set to mature, the Fed would buy the same amount of treasuries going forward to kind of keep things stable. Powell started letting those treasuries go off the books, and so that decreased the demand from the Fed for U.S. debt, and there's different consequences to it. And so the market started freaking out for concerned about liquidity issues, things like that. And so Powell said, okay, well, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to keep going back and reverting back to exactly what we've done before. And again, it's like, that's a problem. Like when you can't, for one, this is the Fed saying, okay, this is a good idea, and then saying, okay, well, we can't do this. So for one, it shows the Fed's own expectations of how the market's going to react is wrong, right? And then it also shows just how weak the economy is. Because like low interest rates on an economy is kind of like giving pain medicine to a patient, right? Because it makes the cost of borrowing so very cheap, and when you can have access to money to borrow, like you can kind of get through.
It's supposed to stimulate the economy,
right? And the problem is we become addicted to it.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that's like during like Janet Yellen's time, one of the tools the Fed uses, like their communication is really important. It's like the way they draft a report on the economy. They're very precise with the language because they know that every word from the Fed is going to be like interpreted as like a sign from God, right? The fact that that is necessary at all, the fact that a press release can move markets is a sign that we don't have a healthy economy. But neither here nor there, that's the thing. It got to the point where like Janet Yellen was having to go in front of Congress and saying, look, like we have been trying to use our communication tools as a way of trying to control what the market, how the market reacts to our new, like, and that's not working anymore because basically the Fed would promise something and they would break their promise and they'd have it enough times that like their communication tools no longer work because nobody took the Fed seriously anymore. Like the Fed projections on like how growth is going to be, like people are like, oh, nobody cares because like this is going to be changed in like the next quarter anyway. And so the Fed's own credibility was shot. Like and like it's.
This sounds really bad. This is like a horrible thing that's happening.
Oh, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. The good thing though is that like once you realize how crazy this is, and once you realize that we're never going to spend, we're never going to pay back our debt, right? Like I don't care about physical policy. Like when libertarians go off like, oh, we're spending so much, I don't care because like we're never going to pay it back. Like we're going to default. Like that's the natural consequence there. There's no political will to reverse it. Paul Ryan tried like a very modest, sort of tweak to like Medicare and Medicaid, and then Democrats ran commercials of him throwing grandma off the cliff, and then he ran away from it, and all the Republicans ran away from it. There's no political will. They're all cowards. They're not going to reverse spending. So why fight a losing battle? And once you recognize that we're going to default anyway, that's where like you can start taking ownership like yourself, right? You can start saying, okay, well, if I don't trust the faith of the dollar in the long term, I'm going to own alternative assets, right? I'm an old Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, I'm an old gold, silver, whatever, right? Real estate, and that's like so. When I tell this to people, and they're like, "Man, I'm terrified." It's like, okay, yeah, you should be, but the way that you can actually individually respond to this is that, for one, inflationary environments always benefit debtors at the expense of creditors. So, like, if you're concerned about debt, like, don't listen to Dave Ramsey because, like, Dave Ramsey's right. In a moral economy, don't cover a lot of debt, but we don't live in a moral economy. So buy that house, take on that mortgage debt, put your savings and de-dollarize your savings, and that's because again the people in charge have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, that's actually very true. I've looked into that a bit, and I know it's a weird reference. The Weimar Republic, when their not the Reichsmark, the Deutschmark collapsed, the people who really benefited were the ones who took out house loans. Everybody who had a lot of debt. So it's yeah, you're 100% right. It seems if you're going to default, it's good to have a whole bunch of debt because you don't have to pay it back.
That's like one of the big populist movements in the U.S. was kind of the free silver movement. The goal there was explicit. It kind of helped a certain group that had a lot of debt pay off and cheaper money and things like that. So it goes throughout history. And again, the actual details, right? The tools can change over time depending on the some of the details there. But fundamentally, the same sort of events, the consequences on a day-to-day life, they repeat over time. When emperors started clipping metal coins, right, back in the day, like that itself is a form of currency debasement and things like that.
Yeah, Rome's currency debasement. Yep.
Yeah, and then the scary thing is that we recognize that the civilizational consequences of some of this sort of stuff. Really,
yeah, we have a good history to look back upon that is not a good place we're in. Now, you brought up digital currencies a little bit ago, and I know that's been like the big haven for libertarians. It seems like the central bank and a lot of these globalists are trying to turn the world economy into cryptocurrency so they control every aspect of life.
Well, one thing it's important to, I think, highlight the difference between a central bank digital currency and a cryptocurrency. With like cryptocurrency at the core, they're the private assets, right? Bitcoin, for example, right, was I think largely inspired, was in large part inspired by the Working Institute, because there was a lot of Austrian background. F.A. Hayek has several important works on denationalized currencies and things like that. So I think there's probably I think Satoshi Nakamoto, at the very least, read some stuff in the Institute. The goal of that was always to create a private alternative, private money versus politicized money. And his white paper, his comments, he's very clear that this is a direct response to the early stages of clown world in 2008, as the Fed was responding to the financial crisis. And so, and I think, Bitcoin, so in particular, and Bitcoin as a boring, original, phase one cryptocurrency, that is very different than what China's done with the digital yuan, what the European, what the ECB is looking at, the Fed is looking at with digital currency. Because the goal of central banks is as I mentioned earlier, to increase the power that central banks have over interest rates and make it easier to track, particularly that obviously particularly to China and things like that. And I think one of the biggest issues we're going to see going forward, the future, I think, of populist policy, one of the foundations is going to be, again, central bank politicized bureaucrat money versus privately held assets. And because at IMF, they have something called special drawing rights, SDRs. They've already used this in sort of bailout things for different countries. James Rickards is a fascinating economist. I don't always agree with him, but he's a fascinating writer. His book on currency wars, things like that. I highly recommend it. He's been talking about this stuff since 2012. That the Fed bailed out the world after 2008. The Fed has not been able to reverse course, and so when the Fed fails, it's going. Who's going to bail out the Fed? It's going to be the world. Something larger, right? That's the globalist dream. It's the IMF, the World Bank. That goal of creating a one world, digital, bureaucratic, technocratic, controlled currency, and the alternative to that is Bitcoin and gold and privately held stuff. And so those two differences are very important. And what's interesting is that they're very clear with this. Central bankers. There's a book that came out a couple years ago called The War on Cash. One of the top goals that's going on right now is that they're trying to ban cash from the economy because it is the easiest way of opting out of the banking system. There was an economist, Marvin Goodfriend, who actually Trump nominated to the Fed at one point. A terrible idea. Worst Federal Reserve nominee of all time. Mike Lee, actually, I worked with Mike Lee's office to make sure that nomination didn't happen. He has like a white paper presenting Jackson Hole is where the central bank had the conference. Every year, very important conference. Like he outlined, look, this is exactly how we strengthen the control of central banks of the economy by banning cash and stuff. Doing it's genius in its own way, in an evil genius sort of way. They're very clear that this is their goal: is to ban cash, replace it with digital currencies, to strengthen their control over things. They try to sell it as, this is boring technocratic stuff. You don't need you little people. You don't need to understand it. Like at its core, this is like an Alex Jones nightmare dystopian plot. It's very, and it's all there. I mean, they write books about it. They brag about this sort of stuff.
So that could be, and you can correct me. That sounds like the World Economic Forum, the Build Back Better program they're trying to do.
Yes, a lot of that is the goal. And they want to create a system where there's no way of getting it. Because private property rights are the check against the state, right? And so that's why the goal is own nothing, rent everything, be reliant upon corporations and things like that. They want to break down the biggest threats to the state power have always been individual noble elites, wealthy families that have earned their wealth. Not with political gains, right? It's in family structures that provide stability and don't make you dependent upon the state, things like that, right? Historically, this has always been the greatest threat to arbitrary state power, and so they're trying to eliminate all these safeguards away, so that if they want to, they think the biggest problem facing the world right now is overpopulation. Well, they have a lot more tools in the tool chest right there to start engaging with all these evil plans they're doing for their own benefit.
Yeah. That could be why they're using the global climate change agenda as well. Yeah.
The state's always looking for a crisis. Too hot, too cold, overpopulation. And they look at history. I mean, Malthusian economics. All the concerns about the population bomb, things like that. And they've been disproven time and time again. It turns out, human beings are really good at problem solving, And so, it turns out like, oh, yeah, if we don't change our farming behavior, for example, and you simply extrapolate out, oh, well, population is like this, our farming capacity doesn't change, we're all going to starve. Well, turns out, okay, well, we find new ways of growing stuff, we find more efficient ways of growing things, things like that. And,
yeah, I've read Thomas Malthus, The Principles of Population. You made a good reference with that. It seems like a lot of his ideas kind of relied upon historical China. Reading through it, he references China quite often. He's like, if there's a flood, there's disease, there's famine, that's a way to control the population. And with his predictions, it didn't come true because we had the Industrial Revolution and modernized farming. So it's like you said, we have good problem-solving skills.
Yeah. And it's like, if you see right now, like, all the concerns about global warming and extreme weather environments, I mean, you look out there and like, you look at charts on like, how many human beings died from weather, and it's like less now than ever before. And it's because we built better structures. We're able to adapt better, right? And what's funny is because the same people that are so big on global warming, they want to lecture us about colonialism and the way that the West has exploited Africa, things like that. Well, like their own policies would make it so that Africa could never have air conditioning, which is kind of something that goes profoundly to like the core of like quality of life for Africans, right? But they don't get to make that decision for themselves because the environmental aspects, and it's like it's totally like one of the, at its core, it is an anti-human ideology. Fundamentally, these are evil people with evil ideas. And what's fascinating is that when you look at these things, like for example, Keynes. Like Keynes was literally, I don't know if he was literally satanic, but he was literally a pedophile. Yeah, he would go on sex trafficking, like renting out little boys from like third world countries that where the villages were desperate, right? And he'd go there with all his elite friends.
That is an interesting fact that there is this immoral behavior that seems to run through all these people who want to implement these terrible ideas. And that's a good segue into the libertarianism, because people often have the criticism that libertarians do not have a strong moral framework.
They're largely correct. Most libertarians are awful. And that's why I've gone to, so in the 90s, Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell, they look at the landscape, and they viewed that one of the biggest detriments of liberty was the quality of its defenders. And so they came up with what was called the paleo strategy, and they kind of rebranded themselves as a kind of paleo-libertarians. And the goal there was kind of twofold. For one, it was trying to make an explicit outreach to the American right, particularly the Pat Buchanan, the paleo-conservative, post-Cold War, conservative consensus. And it's like there was this group that, the conservatives that didn't think that our goal should be kind of continuing the infrastructure of the Cold War, right? And so it was explicit sort of right-wing outreach. But what was kind of often missed in the criticism of it was the second part of it, which is also disconnecting themselves from what they call modal libertarians. And it's those that are the ones that are kind of like the DC reason, it feels good, do it sort of crowd. Because there's a lot of built-in hostility. I don't think Ayn Rand was sort of the worst of the group, but there's obviously tends to be a very militant sort of atheism. There's this kind of there's this hubris that comes to thinking that like reason alone will give you all of your answers, and I don't think that's true. Like I think historically that tends to lead to the French Revolution, more than it leads to the American Revolution. You can't have the American Revolution without the Great Awakening. John Edwards is important as Thomas Jefferson, right? And I think that's the aspect of Christian values, in particular, is something that a lot of libertarians take for granted, and so they think that the libertarian ideas of the West could have happened anywhere. And like people like Mises and Rothbard, they rejected that. I mean, Mises has a great article about how the liberty was always kind of a uniquely Western idea. Again, contrasting it to some like the Eastern, Chinese political traditions and things like that. And I think that's something that plagues a lot of libertarians, is taking for granted the Judeo-Christian aspect of the West and the way that directly led to the development of what we consider to be libertarians today. And so that's why I don't like to, I try to use the L word for myself as little as possible, because while I support economic liberty, free markets, all that sort of stuff, I don't want to be associated with most of the libertarians out there, particularly with, I mean, the embarrassment, how many of them were trying to act like, if you don't recognize that the left is a far bigger threat right now to property rights and civilized society than anything, your biggest boogeyman you can possibly find from the right, then we're just living in a very different world, and that's fine. I'm not going to shred on them, but I don't want to be associated with them either.
Yeah. That's probably why I like you, and I like your brand of libertarianism, because you recognize these realities, like these societal realities of where Christian values built the West. It pretty much built the entire economic system. And these Christian values are a reason why Americans have been able to self-regulate, self-discipline, and continue these libertarian ideas. Because early on, we were very free.
Yeah, and the other aspect is kind of an appreciation for nationality and culture. Again, Mises has this great book that he wrote after World War One, because he fought in the war, survived, and he was looking around, and he was trying to figure out how in the world this happened. How did the Habsburg Empire fall? And he understood that one of the issues that you had is you had a multi-ethnic state that kind of increasingly kind of interventionist government. He was highlighting how that creates issues. And even made the explicit point, like, said, look, like, it's talking like something like the immigration question, right, which is a very controversial topic in the libertarian circles. And you get these horrible people at Cato Institute that seem like their big motivations in life, right, are like defending the right of corporations to censor people they don't like, and talking about how stupid Americans are for having concern about open borders. And it's like Mises made the point, that look, like if Australia adopted a policy of open borders, then very quickly it'd be overrun with Chinese nationals and other Asian nationalities. And it's like there's nothing wrong with them per se, but like you put them in an interventionist government, then like the new Chinese majority is going to impose it's going to change the educational system of Australia, right? To teach Chinese rather than English, and there's consequences here. And it's like you can figure out how you want to structure political societies around that. And Mises was a Democrat because he saw democracy as a useful way of allowing the population to change the ideology of the ruling class. But he certainly did not believe in sort of egalitarian ethos that the majority opinion's right. And he recognized that in order to have democracy, because the goal being their political self-determination of people, right, fundamentally, that's the goal. It's not majority rule, it's self-determination. You have to combine that with a respect for political decentralization and the right to secession. And unfortunately, in the West today, there's so much centralization that's been the goal. And you have so many libertarians that fall into this trap of thinking that, if we have, if we only lived in a one-world liberal government, we'd be living in some Ayn Rand fantasy. It's like, no, the EU is not good for the liberty of Europeans. I don't care that they have a common market. Right, and you have so many people that fall into this trap, and it's like that's the danger. And even now, like the amount of libertarians that fell for the trust the science motif of Fauci and the gang, fundamentally they're kind of technocrats by nature rather than people that genuinely fear tyranny, and that leads them to being useful idiots at best for the schemes of authoritarian.
Very prescient. Very prescient. You got a big brain. A lot of this stuff coming out.
I'm not throwing a lot of stuff. I speak fast by nature. I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there.
I love it. We're coming up on an hour, so I'm gonna wrap it up. We got like 10-15 minutes left because after an hour, people don't really like to watch. And let's end on something positive, because I know you are a libertarian yourself, correct?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, what kind of advice would you give to these other libertarians? It sounds like they've been misled. They've kind of been brainwashed in a way to support these big corporations, big government, and that's anti-libertarian, from what I understand.
Well, the best thing is that for one, like, it's so easy to get distracted by things on a kind of a macro scale, right? Like, I mean, most of what I said tonight, right? Terrifying. It's easy to get very black pilled and kind of just phase out, like, oh, everything's doom. I really don't think that's the case. In spite of everything else, I don't think it's the case. I'm very optimistic. And it's because, for one, again, there's a lot that when you understand how crazy the world is around you, you can figure out how to build your own defenses. And I think that's so important. There are stuff that you as an individual can do in preparing for your financial future. protecting your own self, right? Like that's why owning a gun's important. That's why owning your own piece of property is important. That's why identifying parts of the U.S. in particular where property rights and freedom is far better respected in other areas. I live here in Florida, so maybe I'm just optimistic because I've been living in perhaps
You have Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, I got based Ron DeSantis, and even better than Ron. I mean, on top of that, like a couple of years ago, we passed the constitutional amendment that requires a supermajority to raise taxes. We've got a deep bench of talent here. Anthony Sabatini, the state rep in Tallahassee, is running for Congress, who is awesome. I think Matt Gaetz is going to survive this. I think largely trumped up, deep state inspired scandal. I think when Matt Gaetz talks about the future of the Republican Party, like that's something that I think should unite. To me, it inspires most Trump supporters I know, along with giving me something like that's what I want to see an American right-wing party look like. We've got a lot of great things going on here in Florida, and best of all, I think we're attracting the people moving here. It's not like the Texas mistake where like it was trying to attract big businesses for big businesses and it ends up changing the demographics, or like Atlanta bent over backwards the film industry, and surprise, it becomes a lot bluer. I think Florida's going to do it the right way. We're attracting people that actually value their freedom. The biggest thing, though, is understanding that there's no greater threat to American values. And for what, as libertarians, we should take pride in our American heritage. Like, we should take pride in the Western tradition. Like, we should respect it. This is not something to take for granted. Like, we're so lucky because of that.
100%.
And then recognizing that the biggest threat out there is the university system. And like every single, if you're interested in politics at all, at every level of government, there's ways of making paper cuts, if not outright chunks out of the state-controlled education system. And that should be our priority 1, 2, and 3, in my opinion. And you're starting to get normal people to recognize the significance of this. Again, I'm seeing fewer and fewer kind of normal Republicans brag about like their kid going off to college. And we see a lot more talk about trade schools and things like that. The more that becomes normalized, and the more that we rethink the way of what a college degree really means, that we should start seeing it as a net negative and a threat more than something to take pride on. That, I think, is a starting place to get us as a society addressing the real problems of power, which is that the biggest mistake libertarians make is that we focus narrowly on government as a source of tyranny. And obviously that's not true. A lot of the war narrative, for example, are parroted by the corporate press that ends up creating this fake consensus to support these stupid wars, right? The way that university systems have created an expert class that has been given the green light to politicians to embrace these ridiculous kind of world financial policies, right? The consolidation of power, like one of the issues that I have with a lot of the right, that I agree with on a lot of the large social critiques, they really they view democracy as kind of the biggest problem in politics. Whereas like I look around and it's like the areas where the right has had the biggest gains in halls of power have been winning democratic elections. It's Trump, Bolsonaro, Brazil, right? I'm not going to say that democracy is going to save us, but like it's something that I think it's proven to be a kind of a useful tool, a useful tool for us, and so we shouldn't take it for granted. Because one of the biggest problems we have in DC is like how little actually the people that are actually elected influence policy. Like that's one of the biggest lessons normal Republicans realize in the Trump era is that built-in deep state bureaucracy can subvert the will of even the democratically elected president, no matter how much we pretend that he's the most powerful person in the world. And so once we kind of recognize that, I think normal people are on the right are recognizing the actual game being played rather than being distracted by, like, oh, we have an election coming up, we've got to beat the Democrats, if we elect the right person, then we're going to get our freedoms. In my experience, dealing with normal Republican boomers, they realize that's not enough, and so because that's what creates a landscape where chances are we're not going to win. I mean, I'm not going to say that the victory is ensured, but that's what gives us a playing field in the first place to have any sort of meaningful steps in the right direction. And so if libertarians can step up and embrace it and realize that we've got to work with the right and we've got to build meaningful coalitions, then that gives us a fighting chance. We won't win. We won't necessarily win, but it gives us a fighting chance. And so something we can do on the macro level, in the micro level in ways to give us a fighting chance against the evil, tyrannical, bureaucratic localists that want to invade every part of the world.
That's a good little white pill. I mean, not that last part. I mean, that's a horrible Leviathan we have to fight. But that's a good white pill that people are noticing. The education, number one. Media, number two. I mean, you mentioned immigration earlier, so that's another big thing that regular Americans are waking up to it, and even some boomers are starting to recognize this. And you said libertarians are waking up as well. So I like that. That's a good white pill.
I hope it's not just Florida goggles making things look better than they are. But we've got a big task ahead, but I think we can win. Yeah,
I love Florida. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. Do you want to plug any of your social media?
Yeah, if you find any of these topics interesting, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Tho Bishop, ThoBishop. Good thing with the name like Tho, there's not many others out there. And then at the Institute, we do a podcast every other week, Radio Rothbard, where we kind of dive into some kind of Austrian political analysis and stuff with Ryan Nathan, our editor. And then most of my writings at Mises.org. And if you're interested in any of this stuff at all, we are a treasure trove of information. Free ebooks, audiobooks, podcasts, articles, all sorts of stuff.
And I'm going to put that in the description below. I got to edit it in, but it's going to be there. People watch the video so they can see it. Thank you for coming on, Tho. Tho Bishop with the Mises Institute.
Thank you for having me. This has been a fun conversation. I know I talk fast, so hopefully people were able to.
Yeah, I want to have you on again in the future when more stuff happens, because I feel like we covered a lot of subjects. You dropped a whole lot of information, which people who are not in the academic field are going to have to look up.
Well, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.